The I-19 was a submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy, of the Type B cruiser submarine variety. The Japanese Navy would always face the issue of fighting in the world's largest ocean, the Pacific, and regardless of whether they would be fighting the USA, the British Empire, or any of the other colonial powers in the area, enemy fleets and fleet bases would be a considerable distance away. As a result, the Imperial Japanese Navy would build no short-range or coastal submarines outside of midget subs, but would build basically every other sort of submarine imaginable at the time, leading to the most varied fleet of submarines of World War II, eventually including manned torpedoes, midget submarines, medium-range submarines, purpose-built supply submarines, fleet submarines, and submarines with the second highest submerged speed attained during the war, as well as submarines able to carry multiple aircraft. They were also equipped with one of the most advanced torpedoes, the oxygen-fueled Type 95, which was slightly different to the famous Type 93 Long Lance used by surface vessels. The Type B cruisers were fleet submarines and would be amongst the most successful of Japan's underwater forces. The I-19 would be part of the B-1 subclass, the first batch constructed. Submarines of this type were designed to range far out away from Japanese possessions, using an onboard float plane to help them find, track, and eventually destroy enemy warships before they could reach the main Japanese battle fleet or attack Japanese territory. They were capable of just under 24 knots on the surface, using a 12,500 horsepower diesel engine, and 8 knots underwater using a 2,000 horsepower electric motor, the range on the latter being about 100 miles at the most economical setting. As well as the aircraft, the ship was equipped with a 5.5-inch deck gun for surface targets and a couple of 25mm anti-aircraft guns alongside the 6 bow torpedo tubes, with a total of 17 torpedoes carried. Later in the war, some subs of this class would dispose of the aircraft hangar in favour of another 5.5-inch gun or a number of K-10 manned torpedoes, which were basically underwater kamikazes. I-19 would be the 5th submarine of the type constructed, being laid down in March 1938, launched in September 1939, and completed in April 1941, and so was already in active service by the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. Her first operation of note was making a night recon flight, of course using her floatplane, over the Pearl Harbor in February 1942, as part of the little-known follow-up attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces, known as Operation K-1. This involved the use of 5 massive H-8K flying boats, with the objective of bombing the recovery efforts being made in the naval base, slowing the American preparations for a counterstrike. In the event, only 2 of the aircraft would actually make it, and thanks to a combination of cloud, blackout, and radio problems, they ended up only blowing up some unlucky fish offshore and a few patches of a nearby mountain, total damage amounting to a few broken windows, although it set a record for long-range bombing at the time. Rather amusingly, the Americans didn't actually realize they'd been attacked, and the primary result of the Japanese attack was a several-week-long argument between the US Army and the US Navy as to which of them had been irresponsible enough to set off explosives so near Pearl Harbor. A somewhat more successful mission would come about half a year later, when, during the Guadalcanal campaign, she would score one of the most successful single torpedo attacks in history. Patrolling south off the Solomon Islands, the sub sighted the carrier USS Wasp, which was escorting marine transports and carrying out, ironically, anti-submarine operations. At the time of the sighting, Wasp was refueling and rearming aircraft, as well as launching new planes and recovering the previous patrol. The I-19 fired a full spread of 6 torpedoes, of which 3 were spotted by a lookout, and the ship began to turn hard to starboard, but to no avail, as about a minute later the 3 torpedoes hit in quick succession. One of them, possibly affected by the explosions of the other 2, actually came up out of the water and hit above the waterline. All 3 hit the area of the ship's gasoline tanks and magazines. Of the other 3 torpedoes, 2 went forward, narrowly missing the USS Helena and heading for the destroyer USS O'Brien, which managed to dodge one, but in so doing ran into the other. The last either went under or astern of the Wasp, missed USS Lansdowne, and smashed into the battleship USS North Carolina a few minutes later. Aboard the Wasp, various tanks and stores of ammunition rapidly began to detonate in quick succession, starting a series of major fires that set off even more explosions as they reached even more ready-use ammunition. Water mains were breached, and the crew had no way of fighting the fire, which continued to set off anything explosive or burnable that it could reach, and to add insult to injury, also set the sea on fire as it reached oil and petrol leaking onto the water's surface. The order was given to abandon ship, and US destroyers furiously depth-charged the I-19, allowing rescue efforts to get underway for the Wasp's crew. The O'Brien would actually make it almost 3,000 miles further in an effort to reach a safe port before damage and the effect of the sea worked to sink the ship. North Carolina would be able to keep formation despite a 32-foot hole in her side, but would need over a month in dry dock to repair the damage. I-19 would escape the depth charges and would go on to reinforce and resupply the Japanese garrisons in the area before eventually evacuating them as part of the so-called Tokyo Express. In mid-1943, the ship would operate near Fiji, sinking cargo vessels. This led to a dark incident where the sub would surface and machine-gun the survivors of one of her victims in their lifeboats, fortunately only killing one of them. Shortly thereafter, the USS Radford detected a contact on the surface using radar. This was I-19, which submerged, and Radford would continue to prosecute the attack with depth charges, at least one of which would find their mark, and I-19 would be lost with all hands shortly before midnight on November the 25th, 1943.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.